Now available in paperback and e-readers, Isis, Samurai Goddess. The goddess next door takes on kung fu killers in this action-packed martial arts Isis series adventure. Get Isis, Samurai Goddess in paperback and e-readers today. I recently got some questions from another author, Edward Anthony, on Facebook, and he asked to do a Q&A with me. And in this video, I'm going to try to answer all the questions that he asked me. And the first question he asked me is, what was the first book you wrote, what year was it, and what inspired you to write it? Now, the first book that I ever wrote was called The Changing Soul. And I wrote that book in 1995, and I pretty much worked on it until about 1999. And when I wrote it, what inspired me to write it was my own personal experiences in high school and college. And in my high school and college years, I pretty much had a lot of struggles, and especially in the early high school part of my life. And I wanted to pretty much change my life when I was in high school, and I had prayed to God to change my life because I felt like I was going nowhere when I was attending Park West High School. And I really wanted to make a serious change, especially after one of my grade advisors pretty much had written me off. And thank God, after I changed schools, I was able to change my life when I went to Taft High School, and I was able to pretty much bring myself all the way up to be on the dean's list at Taft High School in the first semester that I was there, and I was able to pretty much get my academic career together at Taft High School. I had to spend an extra year there, but I was able to get things together, and then I went on to college where I pretty much graduated at the top of my class. And what inspired me to write Changing Soul was showing how this character had wanted to make efforts to change his life, because he was stuck in a dead-end life, and he was stuck in a vicious cycle, and he wanted to break free from that vicious cycle. The second question is, are there any authors or writers who inspired you growing up? And yes, I do have an author who inspired me when I was growing up. And the first writer who ever inspired me was an author named Richard Scarry. Now, Richard Scarry was the author of many children's books that's related to the busy town world. And this was a book that I got when I was about 6 or 7 years old. And the book from Richard Scarry inspired me to want to become a writer at an early age. And the other thing that really inspired me about the world of Richard Scarry was that my mother bought me these Puzzle Town play sets as a kid, and they had this Mayor Fox figurine. And that was one of the things that really inspired me to become a writer, next to Marvel Comics. Now, Marvel Comics were a major influence on me growing up as a kid. My brother had this really big collection of Marvel and DC comics, and when I looked at the comics, they pretty much were something that was a major part of my life ever since I was 4 years old. I pretty much knew who many of the characters in the Marvel and DC universe were before I could learn how to read. I pretty much knew who they were just by looking at them. And when I was about 8 or 9 years old, what really inspired me to write was comic books. I wanted to pretty much make my own comics, but because I could not draw very well, I wound up making pictures out of words. And that's really how I started setting on the course to becoming a writer. Now, there have been other authors who have inspired me growing up, such as Claude Brown with the classic Man-Child in the Promised Land, and other authors such as Connie Briscoe, and many other black authors out there. And many of those authors pretty much inspired me to write different stories and to pretty much lay out the mission for the SJS Direct Publishing imprint. The third question asks me, what is my vision, present, and future for SJS Direct? Now, SJS Direct is my publishing imprint, and my vision for the present for SJS Direct is to pretty much try to build a larger audience for the SJS Direct Publishing imprint by trying to reach new readers through different publications and different marketing campaigns. And I really see the SJS Direct Publishing imprint as a place to present positive stories about the African American experience, a place to present diverse images of the African American experience, and present different stories about the African American experience and African American culture. As I look at the African American book market, it's a very limited place, and we only get stories from only one or two narratives. Either we get urban street fiction, or stories about single successful black women who can't get a man, or interracial swirl stories, and that's a very limited picture. And that limited picture really does not let us get an opportunity to see the entirety of the black community and the entirety of the black experience as it relates to black culture. So when I do books in the SJS Direct Publishing imprint, what I want to do is tell those stories that present a positive image of African Americans, a humanized image of African Americans, and diversify the images of African Americans and the stories of African Americans, because we really do not get told stories about other aspects of the African American community that do not fit the white liberal narrative. We don't get stories in African American fantasy and science fiction talked about that often. We don't get stories that talk about different parts of the black community, like the Black Gothic subculture or black fraternities and sororities. And when I created the SJS Direct Publishing imprint, it was a place to tell those type of stories so that people could see that picture. Now, the future of the SJS Direct Publishing imprint, my vision for it is to continue expanding it with different titles and trying to reach an even larger audience of readers all over the world. And maybe one day I hope to pretty much expand into different forms of media, because as a screenwriter, I would love to see scripts that I've produced, like All About Marilyn and All About Nikki, turned into movies or television shows on an independent platform like Netflix. Or I would like to see, things like the ISIS series made into animated programming. I would like to see the SJS Direct imprint expand into other forms of media. That's a long-term vision I have for the future. I don't know if I'll accomplish it, but it's something I would love to see. The fourth question asks me, what are my aspirations as an author and a writer overall? Well, my first aspiration is to become a comic book writer. Now, comic books have been a major part of my life growing up. That's how I learned to read when I was 4 years old. And as a teenager, I always aspired to be a comic book writer. That's why I read over 3,000 comic books and learned as much as I could about the Marvel Universe, the DC Universe, Archie comics, independent characters like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I always wanted to pretty much write comic books, and that's why my writing style has a very high visual style where you can pretty much visualize images in your head, because I always wanted to write comic books. And my other aspiration as a author was to get a best-selling novel. I always wanted to have a book out there that pretty much wound up on something like the New York Times bestseller list or the Essence bestseller list. That was something I always aspired to achieve. Those were two things I wanted to achieve in my creative career, as was that. And I also wanted to see something like All About Nikki be filmed into a pilot, or All About Marilyn made into an independent film. That was another aspiration I had as an author and a screenwriter. But as a writer, my aspirations these days are to pretty much build up this SJS Direct Publishing imprint, try to reach a larger audience of readers, and try to present the most diverse catalog of different types of stories so people can get a better understanding of the African American experience and a positive portrayal of the African American experience, and get a better understanding of African American culture through literature. The fifth question asks, I hear you often critique the content of today's comic book creators. What changes would you make if you wrote for Marvel or for DC? Well, when it comes down to Marvel and DC, the big problem at Marvel and DC has to do with editorial. And the reason why I'm so critical of the content of Marvel and DC is because their editors really lack vision. And when it comes down to their products, they pretty much have the story model that pretty much prevents them from reaching the largest audience of readers. Now, since the 80s, they came up with this thing called the event. And the event has pretty much evolved into something that now pretty much overtakes all of comic books. And we really cannot write in an event model, because you have this whole event that pretty much envelops all of comics. And because this event pretty much envelops all the comics in the catalog, writers really can't get creative. Now, if I wanted to write for Marvel and DC, the entire editorial model would have to change, and the entire story model would have to change. Because as I look at Marvel and DC comics, they're just not in a place to compete with other forms of media, especially new media such as YouTube, Facebook, and many other online sites such as Netflix. They just can't compete when you're running an event model. Now, your event model pretty much encompasses all the titles in the catalog, and it pretty much prevents them from having entry points for the new reader to try work in. And that pretty much prevents readers from getting into a book. And it's easier for them to go out and download something like one of my ISIS series ebooks, or, which is just only like $3 and is only 78 pages in one story that's in a self-contained volume, or get a novel like Spellbound, which is maybe a 300-page novel for $3.99, but it's a self-contained story. That's easier for them. Or it's even easier for them to go out and watch a Netflix series like Luke Cage and binge watch it, because I can pretty much watch all 13 episodes and be done with it. Or watch one of these CW television shows, which is done in like 8 or 9 months. Your comic book series, on the other hand, is 12 months, and the event pretty much covers the entire 12 months, and that pretty much prevents the reader from getting into the story. By the time you start reading the second or third issue, a lot more stuff. You've done things with ebooks and Netflix series. You've pretty much finished with that. And by the time 9 months rolls around, you finish with a CW television series. So the customer is not getting the entertainment value per dollar based on the current editorial model and the current story model. Now, if I wrote for Marvel and for DC, the editorial platform would have to change, and the way I write things with my ISIS series and my E-Steam series is that I pretty much try to contain things in one volume. And if I wrote for that, I would be writing for things such as a 2-issue arc or a 3-issue arc. And that's how I usually write ISIS and E-Steam stories. I usually write them in 2 or 3-issue arcs and lay it like that type of platform, but I put it all in one volume. The whole point is I want the readers to have easy entry points and easy access to the material, and I want them to be able to pick up any book and be to start reading the series and be able to catch up on the series as soon as possible. That's why I make the ISIS series and the E-Steam series, have every story be an entry point, so that readers can start with the most recent book, or they can start with a book that was pretty much previously published, and they could go all the way back, or they could start and move forward. This is a model that was pretty much established in old school comic books, and I really want to try to bring that model back, because that's the only way I see comic publishers being able to bring back new readers. If I wrote comics, it would not be towards events, it would be more towards developing the characters and developing singular stories, so that readers can get to know the characters and get to know them through the stories. Because I feel that when it comes down to comic books, nobody's really focusing on the characters and the stories. Everything is focused on the events, and the events are what's really preventing the reader from having a great reading experience. People buy comic books to read characters and read stories. They don't come there to try to be bogged down by a large-scale event. The sixth question asks, to follow up my previous question, what changes would you make to the quality of content better on comic-based shows and movies? Well, the things that I would do to make the content more quality on television shows and movies that are based on comic books and superheroes is to focus more on the story. One of the big problems with a lot of comic book and superhero movies and TV shows is this total lack of focus on story. In many cases, there's so much focus on things like stunts and gimmicks that there is no really focus on plot and character development. And when I look at things like the CW's Arrow, I see big problems when it comes down to characters, because especially when it relates to black characters, they really do not make an effort to try to make the black characters really be strong and well developed. I look at your John Diggle, who's pretty much a butler. I look at your Mr. Trick, who's bumbling and stumbling. Then I look at your Supergirl, where they pretty much made efforts to emasculate James Olsen. And I really don't think that really helps make the series stand out. What makes these series stand out is to focus on developing the characters, developing stories, and to draw stories from the comic books. This is something that really I'm seeing a lot of these superhero movies and superhero TV shows pulling away from. I'm not seeing them trying to stay true to the source material and adapt it. I see them try to deviate, and I feel that that's detrimental. I would like to see more of a focus on trying to stay true to the source material and trying to pretty much make efforts to try to present quality adaptations. I'm starting to see a slight decline in quality of things like your CW TV shows and Marvel Studios. Now, I've been critical of Marvel Studios about their third act. That's something I would really want to focus on when it comes down to the quality of this content, because Marvel Studios, yes, they make very great entertaining films that are a lot of fun, but their stories really lack in the third act. Most of their stories pretty much fall apart in that third act, and instead of us getting a powerful climax when it comes down to the story, it just falls flat, and it just leaves you, it just ends, and then you go on to the next story. I would like to see some more work on the third act to make it a much better story as it relates to the third act when it comes down to Marvel Studios films, because I believe that's a weakness. Another thing that I really have a big problem with both the DC television shows and the Marvel television shows is the repetitiveness. And when it comes down to these movies and TV shows, they're starting to repeat themselves, and that can really make for a boring viewing experience. I'd like to see these TV shows and superhero movies really start to mix it up in terms of content, try to add some little variety, and try to make things a lot more interesting. When it comes down to these comic book and superhero movies, I just see things that are weak as it relates to story and character development in some areas, and I see really weak third acts, and I really just don't see enough variety. These are things that I would try to focus on, because when I'm doing science fiction and fantasy, like the ISIS series, I'm always thinking about ways of making things fresh, ways of making things different, and ways of trying to make the material unique for the reader to give them a richer reading experience. And I'd like to see the TV shows at CW and the Marvel Studios try to mix things up to make things a little bit fresher and more exciting for the viewer. The seventh question asks me if I would define the term spellbound Negroes. Now, the term spellbound Negroes relates to a series of videos that I did around October of 2016 for my 2016 novel Spellbound. Now, the novel Spellbound follows the Matilda Crowley character as she begins her journey into the goth subculture. And the reasons that she becomes a part of the goth subculture relate to how she sees the black community. Now, as I was growing up, I learned about the black community, and that when it comes down to the black community, everyone is always trying to fit themselves into a black box that would be acceptable to white people. And that whole black box that's acceptable to white is how I came up with the idea for Spellbound. Because I was listening to this Susie and the Banshees song Spellbound, and they had this verse in the song talking about following in the footsteps of a ragdoll dance like you're entranced. And that really reminded me of black people in the black community and how they try to follow in their footsteps of that ragdoll dance, entranced, believing that they have to fit themselves into a black box that is acceptable to white people. So they pretty much act in a way that they believe is acceptable to white people instead of trying to be who they want to be. And the Matilda character decides she wants to be a part of the goth subculture because she wants to be herself, not be a stereotype that fits into this black box that is acceptable to white people. She wants to be herself. And the spellbound Negro is an individual who just wants to fit into that box and be the version of black that is acceptable to white people, not be the black person that they have the freedom to be right now. And this is the big problem with many of the spellbound Negroes, is that they feel comfortable being a stereotype rather than coming out of that box and being themselves. But the definition of a spellbound Negro is an individual who pretty much wants to fit themselves into the stereotype black box that is considered acceptable to white people. The eighth and final question asks me, who or what inspired you to the goth subculture? Well, nothing inspired me to the goth subculture. I've always lived on the dark side of life, and I've always seen things from a darker perspective. So, being dark is just part of who I am. I've never really been one of these lighthearted kind of guys. I've always been a very dark person, and I always saw the beauty in dark things. So I pretty much, that was who I am growing up. And I've always lived, again, on the dark side of life. So I've come to appreciate what is great about the dark side of life. Because growing up in the South Bronx as a kid, I grew up around abandoned buildings. The apartment I was living in, my view was that of the Metro North Railroad tracks and an abandoned factory. And growing up, I saw a lot of abandoned buildings, a lot of decrepit buildings, and that was pretty much what I lived with growing up. And as a adolescent, I grew up in the 80s and saw heroin addicts and things like that, and I grew up with the crack epidemic in the late 80s. So I saw a lot of dark things growing up, and that pretty much gave me a unique perspective on things. And when I saw a lot of goths in the 80s and the early 90s, and then later in the late 90s on television, like Jenny Jones, I felt sort of a connection to people in the goth subculture. And I saw the beauty in them, and I saw the beauty in their way of life. I pretty much felt a connection to people in the goth subculture, and I could see what was great about them, and that's why I feel a connection to them. Nothing really inspired me. That was just part of who I am growing up, and that was just part of the world I grew up in as a kid. And as an adult, I began to appreciate the beauty of darker things because that's pretty much part of where I came from. If you'd like to try some of Edward Anthony's titles, you can do so by going to Amazon.com. And if you'd like to try some of my titles, such as Spellbound or the ISIS series, you can do so by clicking the link in the description box. And if you really like the content on this channel, you can donate to my Patreon and help me make more videos and publish more books. A dollar donation goes a long way. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.